Hello and welcome to the People First Potential channel here on Bright Talk. We are in month 3 of a year-long 12-part series called Why Wait to Be Great? And this is for people who are working on personal effectiveness, people who are leaders at every level who are working to develop as leaders, and for teams, people who need to connect in a team environment in order to collaborate and to do great things together. For those who are new to Bright Talk, let me give you a couple of logistical things to think about. First of all, right here underneath my video, you're going to see a tab called Attachments. And I hope you'll open that tab up and take everything there that's of interest. Right at the top, you'll see that I've given you a PDF of the slides for today's presentation. Feel free to download those and take notes as you like. And you'll also see a worksheet called the 12 Dimensions of Trust. As we proceed through today's content, you might find that that's useful as sort of a self-assessment checklist tool. So I encourage you to download that one and use that one right away as well. The others, well, we'll talk about those as they make sense in the context of the conversation that we'll be having. I want to also introduce you to me. I hope to meet you, and I hope that you'll connect with me on LinkedIn so that this can be a two-way introduction. But I'm Deb Calvert, and I'm the president and founder of People First Productivity Solutions, and more recently of People First Leadership Academy. You'll see a link for that in those attachments, and I strongly encourage you to go take a look at the Leadership Academy. There is a lot of content there. Some of it's free. Most of it is low cost, but there are always really good specials going on. And that content is highly relevant to what we're talking about today: team effectiveness, leadership development, personal effectiveness as well. If you have any questions at all for me, feel free to email me directly. You've got my email address there on screen. And by the way, when you download the PDF of the slides, well, you'll have that contact information long-term as well. But I think we should get right into the content for today, because after all, that's what you came for. Our topic today is a sensitive one. We're going to be talking about trust. And more specifically, we'll talk about the 12 dimensions of trust. But I'd like to start with this quote from the founder of Google, Eric Schmidt. I think this is really, really spot on, especially as we enter into an age of information overload. In this networked world that we live in, trust has become the most important currency. People no longer care so much about what you know. They don't even care so much about who you know or how you know. They care more about, can they trust you? Because if they don't believe in you as the messenger, then how on earth can they ever believe any message you're bringing to them? But Eric Schmidt, as he talked about this, he said something else that I think is really interesting. He said that trust can be taught. Now, most things in business, you think about, say, the strengths finders from Gallup. Most things in business these days suggest that you should really focus on those areas where you have strengths, where you can develop skills mastery, and where you can shine by using your natural talents and inclinations. But when it comes to trust, it is actually better to know about and focus on your weaknesses, because no matter how great your strengths in the 12 dimensions of trust, even a single weakness can diminish everything else that you've got going. In other words, if you're not working on and identifying the areas where you are weak in establishing and maintaining trust, then everything else crumbles. And you know because you've heard this kind of research before. For example, from The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey, you've probably heard before that if you are to have trust in business, you are going to be more successful. But if you're not going to have trust in business, it's going to be a tremendous expense to you. I like this little diagram. It says it all very nicely. When you have higher levels of trust, you can decrease the amount of time it takes to do the work, and as a result, the cost it will take to complete the work. When you have high degrees of trust, you have fewer people having to attend meetings, fewer people having to micromanage and check the work, less rework. And because of that high trust and those efficiencies that come from it, you improve your cost savings and your time savings. But the inverse is also true. When you have low levels of trust, you're going to inherently experience higher costs and more time required to get anything done. And this is true whether you're talking about internal or external relationships. So, this trust in business, it extends to the people in your direct chain of command. It extends to your colleagues that you collaborate with in cross functional teams across the whole organization, even to the brand of your organization and your interactions with your customers. So, trust is no small thing. It's not optional. It's not some luxury that would be nice to have. It is absolutely essential to successful business, successful relationships, and your success in personal effectiveness. Now, I do want to drill down on this just a little bit because I think we use the word trust, the idea of trust, just a little bit too casually at times. We don't give a lot of thought to everything that's implied when we talk about trust. But the truth is, this is a weighty word. It's a very high impact, very profound statement to say to someone, I don't trust you. And that's never something that anybody should say casually. You should give that a lot of forethought because there are so many implications to that pronouncement. Now, if you don't trust someone even a little bit, they sort of have a vague sense of mistrust about a person. If that happens, it will affect how you filter and how you interpret and believe what they say. And with all that filtering and interpreting, you may just be missing out on the most trustworthy information, the information that came in its raw form before you did all of that interpreting and filtering and assuming about it. Well, when you describe someone's behaviors with a blanket statement like, she's not trustworthy, even before you say that sort of thing to yourself, you should try to find ways to back up your conclusion with behavioral examples. Is this more of a feeling that you haven't quite put your finger on? Or are there behavioral evidences that somebody should not be trusted? It's important to work that out before you jump to any kind of conclusion. But I'll tell you, one reason that we often mistrust people is that they're operating with a limited amount of information. So, if you're withholding information, if you're not giving feedback, if you're not setting firm and fair and clear expectations, but then you're expecting actions and decisions that require something you haven't shared, well, that's not really very fair at all. Your vague sense of mistrust has created the very circumstances that make it difficult for you to trust somebody. And we also use trust, fairly or unfairly, to decide whether or not it seems somebody has our best interests at heart. So, what I really want to get across to you here is that not trusting someone can perpetuate the reasons that we don't trust them. When we draw conclusions like this person doesn't have our best interests at heart before we really drill down to understand what's going on, when we do that, we are making it impossible for them to earn our trust. We aren't first extending trust to them, and yet we're asking them to overcome the hurdles, the obstacles that we've built. Now, let me say something else here that's extremely important. Everything I just described is something that you do when you're deciding whether or not to trust somebody. But other people do it too. Other people are filtering, they're interpreting what you say. They're determining whether or not you can be trusted based on the information that you have to act on. And they are erecting hurdles and barriers based on some vague assumptions or feelings without ever really getting to any true root cause of why they do or don't trust you. And this is why trust is so fragile. You can spend a lot of time in any relationship building up the trust, the two-way trust, testing, gauging, rebuilding, and then suddenly a single thing can happen. And all that trust, all that time that was spent building up that trust, well, it can be shattered. And that's really unfortunate that it's so fragile, but it's a reality and it's not one that we're going to change. We just have to accept it. And when you accept that trust really is that fragile, you can begin to do a little more to protect it. You can have better awareness that will cause you to be able to solidify and preserve the trust that you establish. Let me reframe this. Here's probably a better way to understand trust, and that is to realize that trust is all about people. Right? Trust is all about people. There's no way around it. So, 2 slides back, we listed the ways that trust is used to explain behaviors, how we interpret what people are saying, how we determine whether or not we're comfortable with people. And all of these references that we make to trust are entirely personal. They're not institutional. Knowing that trust is personal, that it's between two people or groups of people, you want to keep in mind that no matter how good your organization is at being trustworthy, no matter how strong your brand is, no matter how much integrity you have as an organization, that too is fragile. It's all based on the actions of the individuals inside your organization in the ways that they do or don't live up to your standards, in the ways that they communicate and collaborate with each other, in the ways that they represent your brand. So, having a trustworthy organization means that internally you pay attention to what it takes to trust people and to make sure that you can be trusted. No, I know. Right about now, you're probably thinking, but Deb, trust must be earned. And I understand that philosophy. I was raised on it myself. I believe it. But I also know that trust can't be earned when people start with a deficit. When you put people in a deficit position because they're a new hire or because they had a breach of trust at some point in the past, now they have to climb beyond that perception. They have to overcome your perceptions and the obstacles that you're erecting, and it can be extremely difficult to rebuild that trust. Additionally, if you're someone who believes that trust can only ever be earned, well, are you giving people any sort of a chance, or is your inherent automatic presumption of them being untrustworthy, is that an impossible obstacle for people to overcome? How do they ever perform at their best or live up to your expectations if you don't trust them and they feel that? You know, trust is two ways. And if you don't trust somebody else, chances are they don't and won't trust you either. It's just very difficult to trust someone who doesn't trust you. So, this whole people part becomes even more complex when you think about the fact that there's more to trust than just the obvious, right? We think about trust and we think about honesty and integrity. But one reason that so many fail at giving trust or at being trustworthy is that they're thinking too narrowly about trust. They're thinking only about honesty. Well, I have to tell you, honesty does not automatically and fully lead to trustworthiness, at least not all by itself. You probably know somebody who is brutally honest. They always tell the truth in an unfiltered way that actually creates feelings of mistrust. So it's not honesty alone, and it's not this sort of vague idea of integrity. Integrity actually means whole or complete. All the pieces are aligned and fit together, but people usually think about something else when they hear that word. But you'll notice that there are 12 dimensions of trust, and we're going to take each one of these in turn. As I said earlier, you probably want to download the worksheet that I gave you in the attachments because that'll let you track with what we're talking about. And I'd invite you as we proceed to be giving yourself a little self assessment as we go. Because in some of these dimensions, you will have great strength, and in others, you might have a little weakness. And you're going to want to shore up those weaknesses to make sure that you are not accidentally, inadvertently breaching anyone else's trust. You can also use this as a diagnostic tool. I find it's especially helpful when you have a very vague feeling about somebody. You don't quite trust them and you're not sure why. If you use this tool, you can diagnose what it is that might be in the way. And in fact, you'll learn a few things about yourself, like which of these 12 dimensions turn out to be really important to you, so that you can then more effectively communicate with people and let them know what your needs are. Okay, so as I go through each of the 12 dimensions, I'm going to tell you about an example of a person I once worked with who embodied all 12 of these. I hope it's an example that a lot of people can relate to. The situation was this: when we first moved to California, the cost of living was quite high compared to where we had previously lived. And so we ended up purchasing a home. This was in the early 2000s, in the bubble. We ended up purchasing a home that needed a lot of work. It's what we could afford, and it's what we were able to get because there were bidding wars on every single house as soon as it hit the market. So we knew that we had to do a lot of remodeling. We'd lived there for a couple of years by the time we finally got to the point of doing a major remodeling project, virtually the whole house. And the example I'm going to give you is a guy named Steve Rolfe, who was our contractor that we hired. And he was amazing, and we trusted him. By the time this 4 or 5 month project was over with, we trusted him with anything and everything. So I'm telling you about Steve to illustrate these 12 dimensions of trust. Let's start with the first one. The first dimension of trust is competence. Now, competence, it means, of course, that you're capable. You have the skills, you have the knowledge that's necessary to do the job. And if someone is not competent, we say that they're incompetent and we can't trust them, at least not with a certain work product. So Steve Rolfe, we had taken several bids. We were spending a lot of money. We were out of our own comfort zone. So we were quite careful at the onset of this project. But we selected Steve because he was the one who came highly recommended by several former customers. He had numerous credentials, all the right registrations and credentials. He answered our questions easily and fully. He gave us advice. He gave us ideas even before we hired him. And we felt like he really, really knew his stuff. And over time, he proved that that was an accurate estimation of what he could do. Now, let me tell you about his integrity, the second dimension of trust. Early in the project, probably less than 2 or 3 weeks into it, we had started with our kitchen. And early in this project, we had the backsplash being done behind the sink, behind the counters. And it was supposed to be in small tile squares with a single row of larger squares that were in a complementary or like a contrasting color. Okay, so the tile installation was completed in a day, and Steve arrived to check the work around the same time that my husband got home from work. I was actually traveling this particular week, and so I was not home to see this, but I heard the story many times in the years since then. Well, both my husband and Steve, they noticed right away that the squares were not positioned correctly. The small square tiles were all set up in a diamond pattern instead of as squares. And my husband was in full panic mode, like about ready to call me and having a meltdown. And Steve, even as my husband was still processing it and having the emotional reaction, Steve had already instructed the subcontractor to demolish and start over because Steve remembered that I, Deb, do not like diamond patterns. And I had told him that. And so literally the subcontractor had taken a hammer, some kind of tool, and struck the tiles and started the demolition before my husband had ever fully even processed what was going on. And Steve, the contractor, he ate the cost of those materials, of that rework, because he said that he absolutely could not stand the thought of asking a client to live with something that he knew would disappoint them. He didn't miss a beat. He just took the initiative. He did the right thing. It was the ethical choice. And it wasn't about him at all. It was about the long term and about making the client happy. The third dimension of trust. And by the way, as I'm going through these, I'm challenging you, remember, to think about yourself, to think about places where you may have demonstrated similar sorts of choices and behaviors that demonstrate that you have each of the 12 dimensions, or places where maybe you haven't quite lived up to this particular dimension of trust. And there's no blame, there's no shame here at all, because let's face it, maybe you've never even heard of the 12 dimensions of trust. Probably you've never thought about how some of these relate to trust. And if you've never thought of it in those terms, well, then it wouldn't be right to hold you to that standard. Right? This is one of those moments when it's uncomfortable because it's the first time you've thought about something. And now comes time for the decision. Are you going to change it, or are you going to continue to operate as you always have? But this is just to create your baseline. No blame, no shame, no fault at all in today's conversation. All right, consistency. Well, Steve was really, really consistent, even to the place where we were kind of making fun of him, because he showed up every single morning right at the same time, 7:45, to catch my husband before he went to work. And I mean, like, every morning for 5 months, he was there every single day to describe the day's work, to answer any questions, to get the crew started. It was like clockwork. You could tell what time it was when his truck pulled up. As challenges emerged, as questions came up, he very clearly and completely explained what was going on. He'd offer us ideas and recommendations. He accepted our decisions, made us really feel like we were the ones who were still in charge of this. But he was so even-tempered. He was really predictable because he was always there on time. We could always rely on him to take our calls, to answer our questions. And he was really a stabilizer for us, even as we would be wringing our hands or getting worked up about some of the challenges that came up, as challenges always do in these kinds of projects. And over time, we could also sense that Steve was a really loyal guy. We'd observe, I work from home when I'm not traveling, so I had an opportunity to see a lot of this. But you could see his interaction with subcontractors and suppliers and customers. He really, really cared about those relationships and about people, not just about transactional business. There are times when I saw him educating subcontractors, even trying to communicate in Spanish, which he said he was working hard to learn so that he could be a better teacher and communicator. And for the first year, the entire first year after this job was finished, he called us every 6 or 8 weeks just to check in, just to make sure that everything was in good working order. He wasn't trying to sell us anything else. He was simply checking to make sure that we were happy. And we were, partly because he kept reinforcing how we had made a really, really good decision by choosing him. This one may surprise you. It surprises a lot of people when it comes to the link to trust, and that's simple availability. If you think about the people in your life or in your workplace that you really trust, you'll come to realize that those are people who are available to you. They're not remote when you try to approach and talk with them. They don't have their attention divided. They aren't constantly in a hurry, barely able to give you the time of day. When Steve got a call from us, he'd take that call, even if all he could say was, "I'll need to call you back in 5 minutes." He'd still answer. And if there was ever something that was a big question or problem, without us asking, he would say, "I'll be right there." And then he would be, like in record time. It felt like we were his only customers. Sometimes it felt like we were the only other people in the world. We could just tell that we really mattered to him. We knew that wasn't the case because we had made some recommendations. We had gotten recommendations from other people, and simultaneous to our job, we knew 2 other families who were using his services at the same time. And nonetheless, we all felt like he was always available and like we were the only thing in the world that mattered to him. Now, that is really another type of trust dimension, not just being available, but also being fair. Right? So I think we were his favorites, but everybody would tell you that about Steve. Everybody felt like his favorite. But when we would ask him questions like where to go for granite or flooring or custom cabinetry or whatever we were working on, he'd offer options and then he would tick off the pros and cons for each. He would answer any questions that we have. He'd help us to make our evaluations, right? And he'd hold people up to a high standard. Right? He didn't have certain special deals with only certain providers. He really had a great network. And if there was somebody that we asked about that he didn't know, he made it a point to go out and find out about them too, because he always wanted to have all the options possible in his own tool belt. I think it's because of these previous dimensions I've described that he was also really, really good at decision making that seemed transparent, that seemed clear about why he made the decisions that he made. Now, more often than not, it felt like it was our own decision because he was informing us and engaging us. We never felt like we were abandoned, but what he did was he guided us. He told us what to consider, how he'd made similar decisions, the kinds of factors that from a professional viewpoint he'd be evaluating. And he didn't look just at the short term. That was really clear. He looked at the long term, and he would make it relevant to us. Like he would say, "Look, I know quality is more important to you than cost, but you could save here and still get very close to the same quality if you XYZ." And he would lay it all out there in very plain terms that made us trust his decisions and in fact made us trust our own decisions even more as well. Okay, we're going through these. I'm telling you my story about a contractor, but I'm also going to be talking to you about these 12 dimensions and how they are relevant in your work that you do and in your relationships that you have. But let me go ahead and finish illustrating. Here's a very, very important dimension of trust. It's very important because it's also the cornerstone of leadership. Leadership, the cornerstone of leadership is credibility. You must be credible for people to follow you. And behaviorally, the way we measure whether or not somebody is credible is we watch to see if they DWYSIWYD. We look to see if they DWY, SYWD, that stands for do what you say you will do. That's follow through. Following through on promises and commitments that you've made. Honoring agreements that you've entered into. making sure to keep people updated. If something isn't going to happen the way that you said it would happen, that you accept responsibility for that and that you still try to honor the original intent of the agreement with an alternative plan. And that's what Steve, the contractor, that's what he was all about. He would do the work himself. He'd pay extra. He wouldn't stop looking for solutions to deliver on time and as promised. And on top of all that, he communicated every single day, morning and afternoon. He communicated very effectively to manage our expectations and to give us updates, never excuses. He was always taking responsibility, but he would give us updates if something were different than he had originally told us it would be. 4 more. The next one is openness. Openness is all about complete disclosure, not withholding some information that might be embarrassing or might be confusing. Steve was very, very open. He was even open when he knew he was going to tell us something that we might not like. He'd give us his opinion to help avoid us making a mistake. I'll tell you one example. My husband had this sound system that he wanted wired throughout the entire house, and it was going to involve a lot of internal wiring behind the walls. And Steve said, yeah, we can do that. Here's what that looks like to do it. But I want you to think first, think overnight about how fast technology has been changing and how soon that system might be obsolete. You might want to think about some alternatives. And he gave us 3 alternatives. What if you did this? What if you did this? What if you did this? So that you'd have easier access and you'd be able to update that at some point in the future without having the difficulty of that inaccessibility behind the walls. And I got to tell you, at first, my husband didn't want to hear it. He didn't like what he was hearing because he had his heart set on this system he'd envisioned. But he did do a little bit of research. He agreed with Steve. And later, he felt like Steve's openness had saved us a lot of money and prevented for us a lot of regret. So sometimes when we trust people, we trust them because they've been open, even though what they were going to tell us might have been something we'd react to negatively, or even in Steve's case, where it might end up costing him a little bit of money because we spent less ultimately than what we originally planned on. Discretion is another dimension of trust. Discretion is that you are thoughtful about people's privacy, that you are careful about what information you share. Steve was so discreet that although he wanted to put pictures of our house and of this big remodel job on his website and in his sample book, he first asked permission every time he was going to take pictures. And then after he had the pictures, he would show them to us and ask us, could we have approval to use this, in this picture? He even went so far as to, in the future, when the job was done and he wanted to use us as references, he'd always call us first and he would tell us, hey, I'd like to use you as a reference with this person for this kind of a job. Would that be okay if I gave them your name and contact info? And we said to him several times, Steve, we'll be your reference for anything and everything you can imagine. We'll never say no. Nonetheless, he was so careful that he always wanted to check in and just be sure that we still felt that way and that we didn't mind him giving out our name and number. Constructive intent is the 11th of the 12 dimensions of trust. I hope you're still doing the self-assessment as we go through these. Constructive intent is that you are able to give feedback or share sensitive messages with people in ways that don't cause them to become defensive, in ways that don't cause them to deny, duck, dodge, and push back. And they receive the information because they know that what you're communicating is meant to be helpful and constructive to them. So Steve would give us this kind of feedback in so many different situations: subdivision rules, city permitting. He would say to us, are you over improving for the value of the neighborhood? He would talk to us about suppliers that we were going out and finding because of all the other people we were talking to. And if they had reputations for slow delivery or poor quality, he was very, very delicate, but also very complete in how he would share that with us so we could make good decisions. He usually did that in the form of a question. He'd say, "What are your thoughts about?" Or, "Have you considered?" To make us think. But we always felt like he had our best interests at heart. He'd even say that. He'd said, I hope you don't mind. I'm only putting this out there to try to help you out, but totally get it. And I'm cool if you feel differently." But he would just give us his informed opinions in ways that we could hear and receive what he had to say. And last but not least, Steve was a little bit self deprecating. He was so humble and he would literally blush. He would turn red when we would heap praise on him. But one of the reasons that we chose him over the close second, the other contractor we were seriously considering, the other contractor was very different from Steve's demeanor. He was this other guy. He was boastful. We'd ask him because I like behavioral interviewing, and so that's how I was interviewing contractors. And I would ask him for give us an example of a time when you had a challenge and it was going to be a very difficult fix. But he would make claims like he always got it right the first time. So he lost us on this dimension of trust. We felt like he was unwilling or unable to have true, accurate self assessment, and that instead he was all about packaging himself up in some way that wasn't really spot on accurate. All right, so those are the 12 dimensions. Now I'm just going to walk you through them one more time to talk about workplace examples. Common, typical workplace examples, because people never thought about the 12 dimensions of trust. They had behaviors that were accidental breaches of trust when they realized that what they were doing impacted how people could trust them. Well, then they saw the value in making some small behavioral modification. A lot of the work we do at People First Productivity Solutions is related to team effectiveness. And so we do team building sessions built around these 12 dimensions of trust and in promoting some of those discoveries to bring team members back together in really productive ways. So if you think about competence, this one, it can be a huge division between teams. You take two areas of the same company in finance, the AP and the AR teams, right? They have different deadlines, different priorities, different ways of looking at the world. And sometimes they view each other as not being fully competent because they don't understand something critical about finance. And it goes both directions. It's not that they aren't competent. It's that they haven't expressed what the other party needs to know to be able to have smooth workflow and interaction between. So it can be mischaracterized and misjudged and be an accidental breach of trust. When it comes to integrity, the way that this most often gets violated is that people forget to align their actions with their words. So they say one thing, but then they do something else without ever thinking about the implications that has on others for misunderstandings and mistrust. So if you say, around here, the number one thing we care about is quality, but then your actions are doing something that erodes quality and actually focuses instead on quantity or on rush jobs, it's going to be a source of mistrust because the integrity has fallen apart. Consistency, I'll tell you, I see this happen a lot in workplaces when you've got somebody who's moody or allows their emotions to interfere with the decisions they make and the interactions they have with others. When you're not predictable, when you're inconsistent in ways that are even about your mood, people begin to be mistrustful. They may not articulate it in that way, but since they don't know which version of you they're going to encounter today, they begin to proceed a little more delicately and not to share everything in a timely manner because they just don't trust how you might react. Availability, huge, huge one when it comes to misunderstandings. And this one turns out to be really important to a lot of people. Now, those very same people, they don't often say, I don't trust Mary because Mary's not available to me. But they do say things like, Mary always cancels our one-to-ones. Mary doesn't seem to care about me. Mary barely gives me the time of day. Mary doesn't even smile and say hello when she greets me on a Zoom meeting. And that lack of availability gets a little grace for short durations. I know Mary's really busy. She's taxed with that special project. I can understand. But over time, that grace goes away, and people instead feel like they aren't cared about, they are minimized, and that person doesn't see them as valuable and worthy. And so they no longer can trust that person. Now, Mary never realized that by being busy and appearing aloof, that she was creating a big divide that was a mistrust of her and of her capabilities and of her care and concern for others. So the awareness, right? That's what we're all after here. Okay, loyalty. Loyalty. Do I care about people so much that I stay with them for the long term, that I think about them for the long term? In business, it's not new and shiny. The new hires get all the attention. The folks who have been around a while, they get taken for granted. When it comes to decision making, it's about involving others, about being transparent, about sharing the criteria for the decisions that you make, instead of being in some secret room with a few others and nobody knows how it happened or why. Fairness, well, treating people equitably, treating people by meeting the needs that they have and by giving them access and by being receptive to hearing about their needs, and then following through when they tell you what those needs are. And when you make promises and commitments, even small ones, that you follow through and you truly honor those promises and commitments. Discretion's a tough one too. Sure, you need people to talk to, people to vent to. But remember, every single time you do that, the person you're venting to can't help but think, wonder what they're saying about me, when it's me being talked about and somebody else is getting this venting. Being open so that people can come to you, they can understand you, they can know you. That's very, very important. Your place on the org chart shouldn't make you more and more and more removed from people. By contrast, you should become accessible, and you should be someone who is still tuned into people. Keep your constructive intent. When you give people feedback, that is extremely important so that they can receive it without becoming defensive. You'll find another presentation on this channel that's all about 3W feedback, how to really make sure that your constructive intent comes through and your feedback is effective. And when it comes to accurate self-assessment, this means not taking on more than you're truly capable of, not more than you have time for, that you are not stretching yourself to the point of compromising what you're really competent at doing. So it's all about good self-awareness. Now, we've run out of time, but I do want to leave you with two things. The first is a reminder that there's a lot of really good stuff here for you to take in the downloads, including an opportunity to come to another class, a live workshop tomorrow that's extremely interactive. It's all about leadership. And to sign up for that one, you'll go to peoplefirstpotential.com. That's People First Leadership Academy. That you'll come back here, sign up for more of the presentations on this channel, or that you'll go and read the blogs and pick up other resources, sign up for the newsletter that's at peoplefirstps.com, and that you'll reach out to me. I'm Deb Calvert. If you have any questions at all about how to bring the 12 dimensions of trust to your team so that you can be a more effective leader and a more effective team member,